This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. My partner and I were kicking around some of our confusion with millennial and Gen Z obsession with identity and how they hyper-categorize every single aspect of their life. She was recalling the clarion call of the 90s of "don't label me" and the androgyny appreciation of the 80s. In fact, the first time she ever heard genderqueer or non-binary discussed, she was just like, we already have a word for that, that's androgyny. However, we dug deeper into some of the serious differences between the generations, and she discussed how our identities back then were ethoses and aesthetics all combined into one. If you were goth, your wardrobe was goth, you had the goth outlook, you listened to goth music, and you had mostly a shared level of ethical beliefs of other goths around you. These ethics were very blurry and unclear compared to today because without the modern internet, you really only knew what you bumped into. I, of course, couldn't attest to this because I was a straight-edge kid thanks to my hyper-religious upbringing and always joke about the goth and punk kids of, if you can't think different, look different. Then it struck us. There's no counterculture anymore thanks to the internet because there's no longer any mainstream culture. Postmodernism, or post-constructionalism, is the descriptive concept that there is no longer any overarching national or even party meta-narrative because we have so many sources of information to draw from. We now have our own personalized ethics and meta-narratives about reality, which makes it really hard to have discussions online without having the same frame of reference. This is not necessarily a bad or good thing, but it does make quick communication a lot harder. With the advent of radio, and especially television, there became a dominant unifying culture that dominated America. Starting with the FDR coalition and the liberal consensus that a middle ground between communism and fascism was the best option. McCarthy stamped out collective knowledge of Marxism as failed and evil. As time progressed, Ike, Kennedy, and then Johnson took a more anti-communist jingoist stance. Then Nixon cranked it up, and the war on drugs, aka let's imprison more black people than the USSR has in prison now, and it brought in the first hints of neoliberalism, especially as desegregation was being fought and minorities were for the first time getting access to welfare that used to be reserved for whites, only now to allow politicians to denigrate all social programs as being only for lazy black people, so we must end them at all costs, or they will never know the dignity of work. Never mind that it was mostly white people on welfare and most black people knew very well the dignity of work cleaning up after white people. Reaganomics, where unions were busted, short-term profits took priority over long-term, causing people to suddenly all stress out about having and keeping their job, which led to wage stagnation, heavy subsidies to coal, oil, and farming, all while hypocritically preaching that the free market would solve everything, which, had that been true, these subsidies would have never been needed. A heightening of Cold War spending caused the debt to spike 3 times the level than under Carter, and 2 times under Bush Sr. Thanks to the meta-narrative, at the time, we had no real good way of talking about any of this or actually analyzing the problems involved that got us here. The dominant culture had blinders on beyond a very narrow set of ideologies of liberal versus conservative, oblivious to the fact that there was a wide range of lenses to view things from. Politics started to become a joke under Clinton with Gingrich and the constant barrage of pointless investigations to get attention, which did finally end up with the Lewinsky scandal, but that's also when 24-hour cable news took off and they had to fill it in with garbage to kill time and still have people view it. People on the left derisively refer to the Clintons as neoliberal, but thanks to the shaping of the minds of mainstream culture, at the time most Americans were neoliberal, as are many on the left actually, and if you didn't at least pretend to be that, you could never end up winning at all. Clinton did raise the minimum wage and cut the deficit to the point that we would be debt-free by 2012, but George W. came in and doubled the debt again with 2 pointless failed wars and borrowing and spending, all while calling the Dems the tax and spenders. But none of this dominant culture went opposed. We always knew something was wrong. We just couldn't put our finger on it because we were blindsided by this meta-narrative of the time. It started with the Beat generation, derisively called the Beatniks. This generation had an anti-materialist ideology, and the spiritual ideas were more important. However, the dominant culture was easily able to create a stereotype of them, and they were just an example of lazy kids who didn't want to get a job. Next came the hippies, who took the Beat generation to a more extreme as the hyperconformity of the 50s died down. The first environmentalists, anti-war protesters, lots of attempts to live off the grid, be self-sustaining, experiment in free love, and lots of mind-altering drugs promoted by Dennis Leary as incredibly spiritual. The dominant culture also stereotyped and caricatured the hippies as all dirty, stinky, and lazy, who didn't work or get a haircut and did drugs and became violent, even though most of the violence at the time was caused by all the lead and mercury and heavy metals they were all telling us was completely safe for half a century. Therefore, Nixon could easily get his war on drugs through, which he used to mercilessly persecute minorities and anyone of extremely different points of view. The hippies kind of died after the Vietnam War wound down, and many cut their hair, got cleaned up, and joined the hyper-materialistic yuppie generation, and many found the Lord, and using these organizing tactics they had learned in their hippie days, helped them establish the religious right that helped Reagan win. Mind you, the number of these people in the counterculture were a small minority. A significant majority supported the dominant culture in consensus until the dominant culture told them it wasn't cool to like anymore, like the war in Vietnam. Disco was a hybrid of dominant and counterculture that became a great welcoming environment to women, people of color, and the LGBT, while rock remained the purview of only straight white men. Punk spiked in the UK with the advent of Thatcher and neoliberalism, but since punk had too many negative connotations in the US, we got a new surrealistic version called New Wave, and you got androgyny like Bowie, Twisted Sister, and Boy George, which were scandals at the time. Hair metal bands were considered manly at the time, but would have been viewed as very gay in the 2000s. Punk made inroads into US culture, but with American twists such as grunge, which was also a rebellious movement and feelings of hopeless depression. Goth took this to the next level, idealizing the melancholy and morbidity of depression, as no one was talking about mental health at all at the time. We had to self-treat or end up committing suicide. As the war on drugs raged and many jobs in the city shifted heavily to rural and small town areas, school programs and basic utilities were drastically cut to many black neighborhoods where gangs were created as a form of self-defense, as police wouldn't go to those areas because they didn't generate any tax revenue. Without access to music classes in schools and instruments, they learned how to sample and use spoken word poetry called rapping, creating the entire genre of hip-hop as a counterculture to the white war on drugs, police brutality, and extreme incarceration that made US the nation with the highest prison population in 1991, which is now double what it was per person, only possibly matched by North Korea. As things progressed with the early internet, many of these aesthetics and ideology and identity got taken over by music genres, industrial, hip-hop, alternative, all while the internet started to rise. Probably emo was the last gasp at music counterculture before the meta-narratives began to break down totally. One counterculture that had always been mocked and treated with derision, that had always been there since the 50s, was the nerd culture, counter to the jock culture, which reached their peak around the late 2000s, where after years of isolation, the internet helped us all find each other, and we created fun, robust conversations and DIY art and cosplay around our favorite novels, movies, shows, and anime, as opposed to the all-encompassing national religious obsession with sports that you were treated as weird or lame if you didn't like them, and instead did the egghead reading. Since corporations had full control over these franchises, they were more than happy to at first make some good adaptations, and then began cranking out mediocre en masse. By the end of the 2010s, nerd culture became just mainstream culture, and no one made fun of you anymore. As dominant culture began to crack, counterculture identities also began to break down with the rise of the internet. Without that and an out-group mindset, people needed their own individual personalized identities within the framework of everyone being accepted for who they are. It was at this point of hyper-acceptance of internet culture and the blinders of the dominant culture destroyed that some more extreme countercultures came out. Anarchism and socialism, for the first time in generations, were able to become known and messaged, creating an identity around no longer a counterculture but a political ideology. On the other end of things, starting in early 1995, white supremacy invested heavily into the internet to get their message out, but only gained real popularity when the Internet 2.0 went from losing money to develop a user base to going public and shifting over to money-making algorithms, which the worst people on the internet figured out how to exploit, along with foreign actors allowing the giant corporations to help promote fascism and white supremacy, all under the false banner of free speech and marketplace of ideas. In many ways, fascism became the new punk rock, as it was one of the last forms of counterculture on internet mainstream, but heavily helped by giant corporations and foreign influencers. Finding your own distinct identity in this everyone is accepted new mainstream culture is essential to the younger people to get the same feeling of belonging, yet also fighting against the system that we got from counterculture in my day. Our generation mocks them some, but when you understand that counterculture is dead and only exists in the most radical spaces, it makes a lot more sense. Prior to the internet, everyone was forced into a mold. If you didn't fit that mold, you could be mocked, bullied, isolated, abused, or end up jobless and homeless. We reverse that and everyone's welcome in healthy circles, but they have no way to get any grasp of who they are as individuals, so instead they use a long list of descriptors like taxonomy to define themselves depending on what they believe and what gender, sexuality, mental health status, and sexual philosophy they follow. The kids hyper-focused on identity aren't broken. The system that forced everyone into conformity was broken, and this hyper-focus on individual identity is a way to adjust to this new norm of acceptance. I have a feeling this will change in the next decade when acceptance is normalized, and maybe the need for identity and descriptors may feel less necessary or just normal. To Gen X and elder millennials, this is a weird, childish, and distracting from the real issues, but wearing black lipstick and eyeliner because materialism was rapidly destroying the planet and your mental health wasn't addressed was viewed as just as weird and denigrated as you were trying to find your feet and your own identity. The difference is that these kids have better resources and there is so much more acceptance and will figure out their way to their own long-term identity much faster than we did. Basically, identity is important to all young people, including the don't label me generation. That was your identity, but instead of reacting to injustice they can't quite put a finger on because the facts were purposely obscured, they actually have so much more access to facts and are now finding identity in acceptance as opposed to exclusion or feeling excluded, which is so much healthier. It might look silly to the older generation, but we thought hairbands looked manly and cool, so we don't have a lot of room to talk. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.